and the world has lost hope. About 50 years ago, last month, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. He was elected in 1961, inaugurated in 1961, elected in 1960, under a wave of hopeful, youthful optimism in our country. Now, the election itself was close, but by the time he was elected, a new sense of enthusiasm had taken the country by storm. Him and his wife, Jackie and Jack, together were not just President and First Lady. They were celebrities. They were taking the entire nation under their wings, and everybody was just along for the ride. And he made great promises to the nation, but they weren't promises that we will do things for you. They were promises that you must step up and do them for each other. And then together we can accomplish great things. And out of that youthful, hopeful optimism, the entire nation felt eager to move into the new century that was just around the corner. Until November 22nd, 1963, when he was assassinated and killed, when all the hope seemed to leave this balloon. And people were left wondering. I wasn't alive at the time. Some of you were, and you remember that day. You remember the stories associated with it. You remember the pain, the shock, and you remember the sense that perhaps we have just lost hope. And that's what happens when the guy you hope is going to do something for you ends up dying. And that's what happens when the guy you think is the savior of the society ends up getting killed. A few years ago, our country was drunk on hope again. In 2008, we were inundated with hope language on one side and maverick language on the other side. Some of you remember these days. And one side was all about hope, 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 and we can do this, and yes, we can. And the other side was all about, hey, we're different, we just like being different, and we're just different. So be different with us by being different. Let's all be different together. And so out of those two things, one group of people really, really rose up to the surface. And we're talking landslide victory for Barack Obama, who in January of 2009, on the coattails of a landslide, was entering into the presidency to a world of hope. 67% of the people approved of the job he was doing, and he hadn't started working yet. 67% of the people approved of him merely on the basis of hope. Because all throughout the presidential campaign, all throughout that, he began to make promises, and people latched onto those promises, and they entered into this new phase of existence with exuberance and hope. But the times, they have changed. And in 2013, December, as a matter of fact, the approval rating is 39.8. I went to one decimal point because 39 is more impressive than 40. And 39.8, according to the Real Clear Politics blog, which takes all the different polls and puts them together into an aggregate poll, they claim this is the lowest job approval rating that President Obama has had since he's taken office. They also claim that almost no president who ever drops below 40 ever gets back above 40. And we're talking, he has just begun this new term of office. It's as if the balloon of hope has been popped and all the air has gone out. And now we're in a society where hope is not the predominant emotion anymore. Well, I don't want to make a political statement, but I do know why this has happened. You know why it's happened? I mean, it's almost obvious. It's happened because the promises that were made were far too big than any reality that could have come. No president could have a high approval rating at this point in time compared to the promises that were given to us back in 2008 and again in 2012. And I don't blame the president. I blame all of the people who believed these promises. Because as you paid attention to the promises were all vague. The promises were, we can change things. The promises were, we can work together. The promises were, yes, we can. What? I don't know, but we can. Those were the promises. It's all of us who read our own thoughts into the promises and developed our own sense of hope into what was coming. In fact, I jotted down a couple ideas here for for the different groups of people in our country and the different hopes they had developed. The patriots in our country developed hope that a war would be won. But the pacifists developed a hope that the war would just be ended. The poor people developed a hope that health care would finally come to them. Minorities developed a hope that they would finally be heard. Immigrants developed a hope that they could gain citizenship. Compassionate people developed a hope that social injustice would be addressed. Progressives developed a hope that maybe our country would finally move away from religious moralism. Political critics developed a hope that maybe our leaders could start cooperating with each other. And everybody developed a hope that perhaps the economy would get better and next year's Christmas would be better than this year's Christmas, and on and on and on. But the reality is that parts of the war are done and other parts are still going. The reality is that our health care is really, a little bit cheaper, but also more complicated. The reality is that our government has accomplished some things, but is also more divided along party lines than ever. The reality is that we aren't much better off now than we were 6 years ago, but we're also not much worse off either. But the problem is that we all put our own sense of hope underneath the umbrella of the promises that were given. And now that the hope has been deflated, everybody's blaming the person who made the promises. See, that's what happens. Nothing deflates hope more than disappointment. And when the promises are given and the reality doesn't fully match up to the promises, at least the way I interpret the promises, then we really get into trouble. And like I said, this is not a political statement, because most of the people, or I won't say most people, many people in this country, they don't have a job approval rating problem with President Obama. They have a job approval rating problem with God. Because he has made a promise that hasn't yet happened. And no matter what angle you look at the promise, you have not seen it come to reality in your life, perhaps. It's in the Christmas story. Luke chapter 2, verse 13 says this: "Suddenly a great company of the heavenly host appeared, with an angel praising God and saying, 'Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests.'" 2,000 years ago, God promised peace on earth. I haven't seen it yet. It hasn't come yet. We haven't experienced it yet. And perhaps some of you are like, "I don't even care about peace on earth. I just want peace in my home. I don't even care about peace on earth. I just want peace in my car when I'm driving to work. I don't even care. I just want peace in my heart. If I could just have a moment or two of peace just inside my heart, then maybe that would be enough. And I don't even have that much." And so as a result, disappointment has settled in. And once again, God has disappointed people. And once again, they have given up on him because their hope is lost. And we, who show up on Sunday morning with a little bit of optimism and hope in our hearts, have to go back out to that world, to a world that has given up on God, to a world that is disappointed with God, and go back out there and say, what do we say to that world? Where is the hope? Just to highlight this one step farther. It was 50 years ago that Kennedy was assassinated. It was 150 years ago, 1863 on Christmas Day, when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem called Christmas Bells. He was writing this poem because it was Christmas Day. And yet his son, 1 month earlier, was critically wounded in the Civil War. And he writes, "I heard the bells on Christmas Day. Their old, familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then, from each black, accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south. And with the sound, the carols drowned of peace on earth goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the houses born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair, I bowed my head. There's no peace on earth, I said. For hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. If you're familiar with the poem, you know there's another stanza which follows. And in that final stanza, Longfellow tries to shine just a little bit of hope. He tries to shine just a little bit of light into his own despair. And there's a sense at the end that maybe he's found a little bit of hope. But for now, I want you with me to just settle into this idea that despair has come because the expectations have not been realized. And even though it's Christmas Day once again, and even though it's 100 years ago, there is no peace on earth. And to this day, it still hasn't come. As we look in Luke 24 today, we find a story of two guys who are in exactly the same place as those disillusioned after JFK's assassination. Of those disillusioned now because the hope of the new president hasn't accumulated into reality. And also, like Longfellow, who found despair on Christmas Day. We find two guys. It's not Christmas, but for them, it's at the end of a long journey with Jesus. And these two guys have just spent Passover in Jerusalem. They're now on their way back home because the events of Passover and the Sabbath to follow have been so disheartening, so upending, and so renting, so tearing at the fabric of their heart that they've got nothing to do but just go home. And they're walking home in sadness, in despair, disappointment, and no hope at all. And all they can do is blame the one who made the promises. Let's take a look at it. It's in Luke chapter 24. We pick up the story in verse 13. It says this: now that same day, we'll find out what day this is, but I'll just tell you, it's Sunday. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Now, here you're at a disadvantage, because you know a little bit more of the story than you should at this point. See, you probably have heard the story of the two guys walking to Emmaus. If you haven't, go to more Easter services, because that's when it shows up. Because this Sunday is the Sunday we celebrate by Easter Sunday. And you know too much of the story. You know that Jesus has come back to life. You know that he's the guy walking along with them. But I'm asking you to forget it. I'm asking you to put yourself in their shoes at this moment in time. Because all they know is Jesus is dead. And this guy who's just come up to walk next to them, they don't know who he is. They were kept from recognizing him. I don't exactly know why they didn't recognize him. Maybe it's because a dead man isn't usually walking next to you. Maybe the last time they saw Jesus, he was bloody and scarred, and now he's not. Maybe the last time they saw Jesus, he was just normal human being before resurrected human being, and maybe something happens to your body when God resurrects you from the dead, and it looks a little different. I don't know the reasons why they don't recognize him, but they don't. And so in order for us to understand the story, we have to put ourselves in that position and just call this man a stranger. We don't know who it is. All we know is it's Sunday. Things have happened. And let's find ourselves in that part of the story. Let's keep reading. It says this, verse 17. He asked them, the stranger asks them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? They stood still, their faces downcast. Ironically, that's the song for A New Hope. I wanted to use a video clip from Star Wars for today so much. Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate that. Now the internet is going to be all messed up because it's going to have no context. I'll explain it later. So Anyway, here it is. Jesus is asking them. He says, what are you talking about? And these guys have nothing. They are just so totally upset. They're downcast. They're depressed. They're sad that they've got nothing. They stop walking and look at the ground. So they're talking about this stuff. A stranger comes up. He says, what are you talking about? And they can't even talk about it. They can't even put their minds back to start the story over again because it's too sad. And so they stop and they look at the ground. If we keep reading the very next verse, one of them, Cleopas, asked him, the stranger, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? He looks at the stranger. He says, are you joking me? How could you possibly have been in Jerusalem and now not have a clue what's going on? Are you dumb? See, Cleopas is so offended by the fact that this guy would ask such a question when he himself is so hurting. Have you ever been irritated with someone when you yourself are in pain? Yeah, that's what's going on here. He's so in pain that he looks at the stranger and he just says, listen, you must be deaf, blind, or stupid because this has been all over the news. Because everybody in Jerusalem would have known this. But the stranger doesn't get fazed. The stranger just says, what things? What things, he asked. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what's more, it's the third day since all this took place. There's such despair in that line. But we had hoped that he was the one. And our own rulers killed him. Our own leaders killed him. And what's more, it's only been 3 days. Don't bug me. I can barely keep myself together now. It's only been 3 stinking days since this has happened. I haven't come to terms with it. 7 stages of grief haven't even been invented yet. Don't bug me. It's been 3 days. And we'd hoped he was the one. In order to understand what they're talking about, we have to figure out what their hope was, what it was they were hoping for. And in fact, it's quite clear, because the ancient Israelites were very clear about what they were hoping for. God had given them 4 promises in the ancient scriptures that all they wanted to see was these 4 promises come to fruition, and they had hoped that Jesus would be the one to fulfill these 4 promises. And they're quite clear in the Old Testament. There might even be more, but here are 4. Number 1, God had promised to them a prophet like Moses. One who would speak God's words to them. Remember, Moses went up onto the mountain. He came down with the 10 commandments. He came down with God's law for the people. And then Moses said there's going to be another one. In fact, in Moses' final words to the people, which is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' final sermon to the people of Israel before he climbs back up onto a mountain and dies, and God buries him up there, Moses' final words, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, says this, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." And there were many prophets that came in the 1600 or so years from the time of Moses to the time of Jesus. There were many prophets that came, but none of them were like Moses. None of them spoke God's word to the people with the same kind of authority. None of them affirmed a brand new law, a brand new relationship, a brand new covenant, a brand new agreement between God and human beings like Moses did. Moses set it up and no one measured up. But God didn't just promise a prophet. He promised a king. And not just any king, he promised a king like David. And so God says to David, I'm going to make you a promise. And then that promise shows up over and over in the Old Testament, time and time again, this promise of a coming king. But we read the story in 2 Samuel chapter 7, when this promise comes to David himself. God speaks to David through Nathan, and he says this, "When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He's the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. And in those 3 dots, where I had to cut it out for the screen, in those 3 dots, God says through Nathan to David, he says, listen, this king that's going to come from you is going to make mistakes. And when he does wrong things, I won't give up on him like I gave up on Saul. Instead, I will love him, and I will restore him, and I will love him for forever. And then your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. In that prophecy, in that promise, God tells David, there's always going to be a king on your throne. But he also does this other thing. God, in his prophecy, does this weird thing where he says, but this king that's going to come after you is going to screw up. Now that's fascinating to me, because David's son Solomon is the one who built the temple. And he screwed up. Married like 700 women and then had 300 others on the side. That's crazy. But anyway, then his son Rehoboam screwed up. Made huge mistakes. The country got divided. Then his son, and then his son, and they all messed up. They all failed God. None of them was 100% committed to God. It was one train wreck after another. But God had promised a king who would sit on a throne forever. A king who would call him father, and he would call that king son. It was clear that this human king, this chain of human kings, was not good enough. They needed something else. They needed some almost non-human king. They needed some king who could be called even God's son somehow. They needed that kind of king, and they were waiting for him to finally come. God had also promised them a land of peace. A land of peace. Have you ever heard the phrase, the lion will lay down with the lamb? That comes out of Isaiah chapter 11. In the New Modern Translation of the NIV, that lion gets retranslated into the word wolf. I haven't studied to find out exactly why they decided to translate it wolf, but here it is in the new NIV, Isaiah 11. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. God had promised a kind of peace that was going to be so great that in this world, children and lions and wolves could be together and we wouldn't worry about it. We'd be cool with that. Take that 3-year-old, put him in a den of lions, and just watch him have fun. That's the kind of peace that this world should have. God is promising. But let's keep reading. It says more in that chapter. In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the Mediterranean. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the 4 quarters of the earth. God had promised he's going to go and get all his people from all over the place and bring them together, and they're going to be in a land of peace. He's going to bring them all back, bring them together. And that was only the 3rd big promise. The 4th big promise takes it one step further. God promised that he would have a relationship with people. God promised that they would have a relationship with him. A real, close relationship. Ezekiel tells us this prophecy. We find this prophecy in chapter 11 of Ezekiel. It says this, "Therefore say this, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again." We just saw this. Isaiah and Ezekiel agree. They like each other. They're hearing from God. It's the same message, even though separated by years. You're going to come back. I will give you the land of Israel. They will return to it and remove all its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. God says, I'm going to put a soft heart into you so that you can have a softness about you in relationship to me. And then, finally, it says this, then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God. God had promised them a brand new relationship with a brand new heart, that their softened heart could come to him and he would be their God and be proud to be called their God. And they would be his people and he would love to have them as his people. A relationship, a covenant, just like Moses had done, but now even better. And these guys, walking to Emmaus, had hoped that Jesus would have been that guy, the prophet, the king, the cause of the land to have peace again, the source of a relationship with God through a new covenant. They had hoped he would be the one, but he wasn't, because he's dead. Let's look at that verse again. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. Keep going. It says, they came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. Listen, we read this passage, and because we've got the part of the story in our brains that we shouldn't have in our brains at this moment in time, we read the story and we're like, oh, they've got some hope. Oh, they've got some hope. No, remember, these are the same guys who, walking on the road to Emmaus, stopped in their tracks, hung their heads down, and said, but we had hoped. They have not suddenly gained hope in the next two sentences. They are still just as hopeless as before, because after all, this happened in the morning. They left Jerusalem after they heard this story. They left Jerusalem after the women found an empty tomb. You know why? Because in their mind, their hopeful king is dead, and we don't even know where the body is. In fact, if you look at a couple verses before, in verse 11 of chapter 24, it says specifically that the women come back from the tomb, they share their story, and all the dudes don't believe them. Because it says this, in Luke 24:11, it says, their words seemed to them like nonsense. And even if Jesus had come back, he hadn't come to them. Come on, Jesus, we were with you for 3 years. If you're going to come back to life from the dead, you come to us. You say, hey, I'm back. You say, hey, I'm here. But no, it's the third day. Nothing. We don't even know where the body is. Angels, whatever. Listen, these guys illustrate a principle for us that we need to get a hold of. And it's this. Jesus never comes the way we expect him to come. Jesus doesn't show up like we expect him to show up. And we can develop all our sense of hope and idealism and expectation, but Jesus, when he shows up, it's different. Jesus is the kind of guy who shows up as a baby in a manger. Jesus is the kind of guy who shows up surrounded by shepherds. Jesus is the kind of guy who shows up in the lowest of the places of society and loves on the people there. Jesus is the kind of guy who shows up on a road and you don't know who he is, and he keeps his identity silent, and he doesn't just say, hey, I'm the dude. He walks up next to you and talks to you and has a conversation with you to find out where you are and what's going on. But here's the deal, okay? One of the most dangerous things that can happen in a person's life is for them to know Jesus just enough to develop expectations. Because if you know Jesus just well enough to develop some expectations, you're eventually going to find disappointment. And you're eventually going to blame the person you thought made the promises. And your approval rating for Jesus is going to drop below 50, and that's going to be all she wrote. Some people say, try Jesus. Sure, try your own idea of Jesus, and you end up with your own idea of disappointment. These guys are face to face with what they really need, but they can't see. Let's keep reading. Keep reading in the story, and what we find is Jesus begins to talk back to them. He says to them, how foolish you are. I just love him. You know, here are these guys, they're distraught, they're downtrodden, they've got no hope in the world, and Jesus looks at them and says, you guys are kind of dim-witted, aren't you? Have you been missing the entire story? What's happening here? You know, do you take your medicine today? He said, how foolish are you? How slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. You see, these guys, they had developed this hope. They had developed this hope that Jesus would be the prophet, that he would be the king like David, that he would be all these things that they imagined him to be, but somehow they missed stuff. Somehow they missed Psalm 22. Psalm 22 was a psalm by David. David the king. David the king, who another king was supposed to come after him, who would be like David. And David wrote in Psalm 22 some things that these guys apparently had seriously forgotten. Some selections from the chapter say this: my God, why have you forsaken me? Those words should be familiar to anyone who knows anything about Good Friday. Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Even David has this sense that maybe God has not kept a promise. But I'm a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. But I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It is melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. This never happened to David. David found himself in some place. I don't know exactly how God did this in his life, but David found himself in some kind of place where he was so burdened, so weighed down by the things that were going on in his life, or maybe something spiritual that was going on in his heart. But somehow David sits down with a pen on a piece of paper, and he starts to put down words that Jesus speaks from the cross. He begins to put down words of himself being so abandoned, it felt, that now he's somewhere where his hands and his feet are pierced. And somehow people are dividing up his clothes by casting lots. And it's Sunday. And this happened on Friday. And somehow they missed it. That's not all they missed. They also missed Isaiah 53. So here they missed a king like David. Because remember, David is the one who wrote, "They pierced my hands and feet." They also missed a prophet like Moses. Because in Isaiah 53, we find a completely new relationship that develops between God and humanity, but it's in a way that no one could have expected. It says this: "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. But surely he took up our pain. He bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." He was pierced. Let's keep going. He says, "We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Isaiah 53 talks about this promised one to come that we looked at and we didn't think he was anything that we thought he was supposed to be. And then at the end of his whatever journey, his hands and his feet, he's pierced, he's wounded, and somehow all of the sins of the world are placed on him instead of us. And we're healed while he is wounded. And these guys missed it. So Jesus has to explain it to them. And even after he explains it to them, somehow they don't get the picture, because as we read the rest of the story, we find out some more things. But before we get to those other pieces, you got to know this. Jesus himself had also said these words to them earlier. We'll go through this quickly. Matthew 12. "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And the guys scratch their heads. They're like, I don't know what that's all about. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man all the time, and now he's calling himself the Son of Man again, but he's like comparing himself to Jonah, who is in fish, and then the fish like puked him on the sea, on the beach, and now he's got to go and tell them. I don't get this 3 days, 3 nights thing. So they didn't understand it. Clearly they didn't understand it, because just a couple chapters later in Matthew 16, we get this. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. Can you get any clearer? And it didn't just happen once. It happened from that time on. Like the whole last year of Jesus' time with them, he's saying this thing over and over and over again. But you know what? Apparently, it didn't click. Because, as a matter of fact, the very next verse, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Maybe he was just talking about the resurrection piece. Sure, Lord, you might die, but you're never going to get resurrected. No, he's talking about the whole thing. You're not going to get killed because I'm not going to let it. Because I'm going to find myself a sword. And if anyone comes up to you, I'm just going to cut his ear off. Or something. Peter doesn't even get it when the guy he's supposed to follow as king tells him he's going to be killed. No one got it. In fact, that was part of their problem. What they did is God had made promises. They took the promises like an umbrella, and underneath the umbrella they built up a whole city of hope that was their own hope. Their own idea of hope, their own concept of hope. God had promised a king, so they imagined it must be an earthly kingdom. God promised peace and a land in which they would have peace, and they imagined, well, it must be the dirt under our feet. God had promised them a relationship with him, and they thought, okay, maybe that means we're better than everybody else, and so these Roman people need to be gotten rid of. God promised these things, and they developed their own sense of hope underneath them. And what happened is that the hope they imagined for themselves was blocking the hope that was standing in front of them. Jesus was right in front of them, trying to tell them who he was. And they missed it for years because they had their hope. And so when they say in sadness, but we had hoped, there's a part of Jesus that says, yes, you did. But it was the wrong hope in the right person. The right person, wrong hope. It was their own mistake. Let's keep reading and find out how the story ends. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. I like how Jesus plays games with people. But they urged him strongly, stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? They invite Jesus to come into their house. As the heads of the household, whoever's house this was, maybe it was Cleopas because we got his name. As the head of the household, it was his job to pray for the food. It was his job to pick up the bread. It was his job to break the bread and to give it to the guests. But Jesus steps right in, acting like he's in charge or something. And he prays for the meal. And he picks up the bread. And he breaks the bread. And as he does it and hands it to them, something clicks. All of a sudden, it makes sense. All of a sudden, something happens in their heads and they get it. They realize it. Because 3 dinners ago, this same thing happened. 3 dinners ago, in a tiny little room that was called the upper room, 70 of Jesus' followers were kind of hanging out on the fringes with the 12 in the center at the table. And Jesus took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. He took bread, and he broke it, and he said, this is my body, which is broken for you. And then the very next night, the very next dinner, They sat down to eat because their Savior's body had been broken and they didn't get it. And their hope is gone. And the next dinner, they didn't get it and their hope was gone. But Sunday night dinner, they had a guest who took bread and broke it, and all the pieces came together again. This was their Savior. This was the one who was to come. We had hoped, but now we hope. We had hoped, but now we've got a different kind of hope. Because the hope we have now is a hope of a different kind of king. The hope we have now is about a different kind of identity. The hope we have now is about a relationship with God that is made possible because of his broken body, because of his spilled blood. We now have a relationship with God, a new covenant with God, better than the one Moses brought down from the mountain. We now have everything we ever could have hoped for, but it's beyond our hopes. Those hopes back there, good riddance. I'm glad they're dead. I'm glad they're gone, because the hope I really need is the one that Jesus has already fulfilled. That's it. The hope we need is the one that Jesus actually fulfills. Not the hopes you manufacture for yourself. Not the hopes I manufacture for myself. Not the things I put underneath God's promises umbrella. But who he really is. That's what I really need. And so let me ask you to take this moment. Let me ask you to make it real in your life. Because as I read this story, I see something pretty phenomenal. Here are two guys who've lost their hope. You know what that means? That means they've lost their faith. That means these are guys who don't believe. 3 days ago they believed. Jesus is the one. Today they don't. These guys do not have faith. They do not believe Jesus is the Savior. They do not believe he has risen from the dead. These guys do not believe. Get that clear in yourself. They do not believe. And Jesus goes out of his way to meet them. He shows up in the midst of their disillusionment, disappointment, pain, and disbelief. And he shows himself to them. How loving. How inspiring. And so I want to offer to you a challenge that can lead you to a deeper, greater hope. Before ever sliding into disappointment with Jesus, just learn who he really is and why he really came. Learn who he really is and why he really came. You're going to come face to face with a circumstance in your life that is going to tempt you towards disappointment. Maybe God has let me down. Maybe God has missed the mark on this one. Maybe God's promises for them are not his promises for me. But I gotta tell you the truth. The problem is not with his promises. The problem is with our expectations. And the problem is how we manufacture our own hopes underneath the umbrella of God's promises. But his promises are secure, and the hope that he actually has for us is real, definite, and fulfilled already. He has a plan for us. It's definitely going to come about. So I want to close by asking you to spend a few moments in reflection. To ask God this question: God, how have I been tempted towards disappointment? How have I allowed my own hopes to get in the way of the hope you have for me, the hope you fulfilled for me? And to give us sort of something to chew on as we do that, I want to read you Longfellow's poem one last time, but this time with the final stanza included. It says this: I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then, from each black, accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south. And with the sound, the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair, I bowed my head. There's no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. I'm not sure what cannons have been going off in your life this week or recently, but God is not dead. He does not sleep. The wrong shall fail and the right prevail. He will do this. He is in charge. He has made promises and he will keep them. The hope has already been fulfilled. It's just waiting to come in full. Let's pray. Thank you for listening to this message from Lafayette Community Church. We believe that God has a full and fulfilling life in store for you, and we want to help you live it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, Pastor Jeff, through the web form at LafayetteCommunityChurch.com. And as always, I encourage you to plug into a solid, God-honoring community wherever you may be. Life is a journey, and no one should ever walk alone.